Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'll be doing another doodle video which can also serve for an Inktober inspiration, and this time I'll be doodling a whole bunch of mushrooms. If you guys don't know, I have a thing with mushrooms where I just think they look so cute, whimsical, and sometimes gross at the same time, which makes them look mesmerizing, at least for those poisonous slimy ones. I was having so much fun doodling them that I just kept on going and added more details even though I made 9 types of mushrooms, and therefore I was a little bit tight in terms of time, so I made this video a little bit longer. Whatever though, it's for the sake of mushrooms. I don't really know the name of these mushrooms specifically. Like usual, I just looked at Pinterest for references when I drew them out. Then I just take the overall shape because they're more or less the same in terms of features of the anatomy, just shaped slightly differently and they grow in different ways. But I'll try to put similar references to what I had as I was drawing and outlining them out, so you'll get a better imagery if you decide to doodle along. Just for the ease of explanation, I'll be referring to the features as the cap, the gills which circulates under the stem, the skirt, and at the bottom they usually have vulvas, but I didn't really include that in this drawing. And in terms of the growth, they tend to be smaller with closed up caps when they're younger, and they open and flatten and sometimes have cracks when they start to mature. So this is something that you can keep in mind so you can play around with it when you're drawing it out. Basically for me, I tend to look at the overall shape and I make up my own composition as well as the growth stages. Things like how the cap is going to look like, if the stem is wide, thin, or slightly bent, and stuff like that. I think that's enough of the background info for now, so let's just start to draw these out. I'm going to approach this a bit differently compared to what I did with the autumn doodles. Instead of sketching then outlining one by one, I'm actually going to sketch out all of the mushrooms for the whole page so I can adjust the composition and shift things around when I need to. Then once I'm ready, I'm going to outline it all in one go. For the first one, I'm drawing the fly agaric mushroom. I have an older video of where I painted this with watercolor, so I'll also link that if you're interested. I'm drawing this in the middle because I find that this is probably one of the most iconic mushroom types, even though I did end up making a mistake when I was outlining it. But that's basically how I like to compose, even if I'm going to draw out several types. I want the middle to have the most iconic type or the nicer looking one in terms of detail, so there's still a focal point to the drawing. For this next one, I don't know what these ones are called, but I find that the cap is interesting in terms of shape. They're more flat than usual and also has that slight bulge at the top. And I also like that the stem, even though it's fairly thick, it has cute curves. As you can tell, I'm not copying straight from the reference. I'm only looking at it as reference to understand the shape that I've simplified, and I also form the cluster however I want to, that way it can fit into the composition. You can make larger clusters or even just a single mushroom depending on the composition that you're going for. Here I'm drawing out oyster mushrooms. These grow in close clusters and they're all somewhat connected, or at least from the references that I've seen anyway. Again, they're shaped differently. I find that the caps are a bit more abstract and the gills go all the way down to what looks like the stem. They grow on top of each other very closely, so I drew out all of the caps first, then I added the gills and stems afterwards to just fill in the space. But you can add more as you outline later to fix up the composition slightly. And like all of the mushrooms, I try to vary the angle slightly. So as an example, you can see the one on the right looks a little bit weird because we can see more of the bottom compared to the other mushrooms, but that's okay. I find that it gives a little bit more character that way. The fourth mushroom is the odd one out, I would say. They don't have the same anatomy and they grow flat on what looks like tree trunks from the photos I've seen. From what I've searched, they're called orange Fan Fungi, so that's how I'm going to address this one with my limited knowledge. For this one, I created a frilly circular shape and then added the gills, separating them slightly further apart, and then fill in the shorter gills in between the longer ones. That way I create almost like a floral pattern with this, and I'm just going to draw 2 of them because I have limited space here. I also end up showing parts of the outside by adding a bit more outline outside of the edges, and that way you have a little bit of foreshortening going because you can see a bit of the fold. Next, I'll be drawing what seem to be called the clustered bonnet mushrooms. I like the shapes of their caps, which sometimes has cute round tips and also very thin stems, which can grow very long and curvy. For some of the mushrooms, I also tried to include a bit of greeneries at the bottom, like moss and things like that, so they don't look like they're floating. But if that's what you want to create with your composition, I think floating mushrooms would also look really cute. Moving on to the 6th mushroom, I think this one is quite well known. I'm going to be drawing out porcini mushrooms. It has a standard looking cap which is fairly thick, with also a very thick stem which is a bit rounder at the bottom and is almost the same size as the cap. And I just realized after I outlined this that mine looked a little bit too thin, so you can try to make yours rounder at the bottom so it's clear that you're drawing out porcini mushrooms. You'll notice that I erased my fly agaric mushrooms. That's because I felt like in the composition it was a bit too close to the mushrooms at the top, so I decided to lower it down slightly so the composition is a bit more even all around. This is why I ended up using pencil, because I find it a bit easier to just move things around whenever I need to. Next, I'll be drawing out just one orange cap mushroom. I think it's nice to just have one single mushroom sometimes for a little bit of variation in your composition. This mushroom I find is quite similar in shape with the porcini mushrooms, but the stem is not as thick and round. But I'm also going to give it a little bit of character by drawing out the stem slightly curving. On the right, I'm drawing out what looks like umbrellas to me. I found this picture floating around, which is similar to a clustered bonnet, but they grow from more of a vertical surface, so the stems grow slightly different. I'm also going to add more line textures for the cap to make it look a bit more frilly compared to the bonnet mushrooms. The last spot I find looks a bit awkward. It's small and thin, but I find that it's too big for me to leave empty. So I figured that I would fit in long tiny mushrooms that I like to eat, which are called Enoki mushrooms. The caps are so tiny that the gills are no longer visible and the stems are very long and they stick together in bunches. With this, I would recommend to crowd the middle part so it looks like a good thick cluster of Enoki mushrooms. Once I'm happy with how I've composed the sketches and the spaces I find are quite balanced, I'm going to outline them according to how I've drawn them, with added texture and slightly different line weight so it doesn't look too even all across. I'm going to be using 2 sizes, which are a 0.1 and a 0.05 for finer details. I'm using just ordinary ink liner pen, which is also waterproof. And I always like to use waterproof ink in case I want to do watercolor washes on top. Not that I'm going to for this one, but just in case anyone would like to, it's always a good idea to do this. Or you can also use things like brush pens for more expressive lines if you have access to it. For parts of the stem of the oyster mushrooms, I want to add a bit more dimension, so I added lines close together to form shadows near the cracks and under parts of the gills. And Also a mix of dots and tiny lines, following the curvature to add a slight texture as well as dimension on the caps. This next one is fairly simple. I'm going to just outline them like how it's drawn and double up on the lines for the gills to make them look slightly thicker. In terms of texture, I'm going to add dashed lines as well as to add shadows at the center, which slowly gradates outwards. This is just my own interpretation of it, though you can see that it's not too similar to the reference, but you can add texture in other places also to suit your own taste. I also like to fill in parts of the folds so they look like different textures, but again, this is optional. Because the kind of pen that I'm using has very even thickness, even with different pressures, I like to double up on some of the lines to play with the line weight sometimes, but I minimize doing this for now and always adjust after I've drawn out the main outline or when I'm close to finishing up on the whole page to balance out the values. For different types of mushrooms, I try to add slightly different textures and shadows to vary them. And as I add on textures, I don't always follow the reference anymore, or I have a whole bunch of them open at the same time. So maybe I'll combine certain things that I happen to see. So you can also be a bit more creative with this part of the drawing also. For these clustered bonnets, I want the edges of the caps to have slight frills, but I want to make them look different to the umbrella one on the bottom right. Sorry, I'm just using my own terms here. So for this one, I decided to make the bottom more frilly by adding slightly wavy lines, and then I'm going to add limited line textures on top, whereas for the one on the bottom right, I'm going to add longer lines from the top to the edges of the caps to give them slightly different characteristics. I found that the composition was a bit empty here, so I ended up adding one more mushroom cap, and you can do things like this if you're comfortable drawing without any pencil outlines first. So whenever you feel like you need to adjust, you can either do it with pencil first or straight with pen if you're confident with your lines. Moving on to the fly agaric, I've drawn these out several times, but I did make a mistake on the smaller ones. This is because I misjudged how much shadows I should put, when at the same time I've already included a lot of scales on top of the cap. So just be very mindful of that when you're drawing this out. If you have a fair amount of the scales already on your cap, try to not put more lines for added shadows because it might turn out looking dirty in the end. So this is where I made the mistake. I added a lot of scales on the smaller ones. This is because I remember when I was searching about the AGARIC mushrooms, I figured that the scales were much closer together when they're at a younger growth stage, and as the mushroom open up, the scales disperse a bit more on top of the cap because it is a larger surface. So with that in mind, I still added a bit of shadows, and I just kept on adjusting by adding more. So it ended up looking a bit dirty and out of place. So at this point, I'm just going to leave this for now, but I'm going to go back in with some white gouache to try to cover up as much as I can. But don't make this mistake, because even with the white gouache, you can still see that it's a correction being made. I would just say, if you want to add a lot of scales like I did, to just add the scales and leave out the shadows. With the Enoki mushrooms, they usually have a smooth surface for the cap, but for the sake of just adding a bit of interest, I ended up using my smaller sized pen to add a little bit of texture, just small lines on each of the caps, at least the ones that I can still fill in. And once I finished outlining the stems and also the caps that I've drawn out with pencil, I decided to also add more caps behind some of the stems. I think that this adds a bit more depth to the composition and it makes it look like a fuller cluster. So from here, I'm just going to finish off all of the outline for the last mushroom, and then I'm going to get back to you to fill in the decorative elements and bring everything together. For this last one, I also used my smaller size pen to add the texture and also a bit of the shadow under the cap later on. But as you noticed, I didn't use the smaller size for all of them because in the end, this is just up to your taste. Personally, I don't like having the outline thicker and all of the details smaller. I think that it looks a bit too monotone that way. So I like to vary with some of the larger mushrooms to have a thicker weight than the smaller ones. The smaller ones is mostly because I can't really use a thicker one since it'll look a bit too bulky. So in the end, it's really up to your preference. For the decorative elements, I added small berries with tiny leaves, a branch of berries, also different types of pine leaves. You can do this or maybe create smaller mushrooms floating around if you would like to, and you can just change it up with however you want to decorate this further. I like including smaller elements because I think it brings the composition together, just like the autumn doodle that I did. So here I've got most of the outline done, and I'm just going to go in with my white gouache to cover up my mistake. I tried to use a very thick consistency, but with this white gouache it still wasn't enough, so I made sure to put on a few layers. And once I'm done covering up the blacks, I also went over parts of the scales again with my pen to hide the white gouache underneath. To finish off, I like to look at the whole page, and I see that the drawings look a bit flat because it lacks depth from the shadows and the separation of value. Even with some of the textures that I added, it didn't really affect the values too much, so I decided to go back in to enhance some of the shadows and bring more life to the individual mushrooms. The placement of the shadows of all of the mushrooms are fairly straightforward, but as for the Enokis, because they're so thin and long, I add the shadows behind some of the thin stems that I've drawn out to give more perception of depth and illusion of a thicker cluster. And that's pretty much it. This is the finished page of Mushroom Doodles. I really enjoyed drawing this one, and I hope you guys also enjoy it. Like usual, all of the information about my tools and also my social media links will be listed in the description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!